So, there we are. Another massacre, another Sunday school story. It's amazing how much depth there actually is in the famous traditional Sunday school stories, isn't it? Freedom comes at a price, they say, well-known quote, even though I couldn't actually find out who said it first. It's been attributed to very many different people. And in this case, and in some other cases, those liberated are not the ones actually paying the price. And we'll come back to that later on. But at this point, we just have the Israelites. They left Egypt, and they are heading, well, they didn't really know where they were heading, did they? Except that they were heading for the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants. None of the Egyptians, well, that's also true, but none of the Israelites actually knew this land. They had lived in Egypt for 430 years. They'd never set foot in Canaan. They wouldn't know the way. This was long before Google Maps. So God is leading them. And just before the passage we read in the end of chapter 13, it tells us that by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. That features quite prominent in Sunday school stories, I think. The presence of God going with them, visibly, in this pillar of cloud in the day, pillar of fire at night. That should have been a great comfort and reassurance to them, surely. They should have been able to trust God fully and unconditionally when they see this pillar that God himself is leading them. Well, the thing is, they don't seem to be too convinced even by this. But before we talk a bit about that, I'm going to answer a question that we don't have an answer to. How many Israelites did actually leave Egypt? Well, in chapter 12 that we had last week, the passage claims that there were 600,000 men, not counting women and children, which would make it a massive group of maybe 2 million people. And you may have heard that figure. Thing is, it's highly unlikely. It's almost incredibly unlikely that there were 2 million Israelites leaving Egypt. For one thing, there would have been many more traces of them in Egypt itself if there had been that many of them. There would have been an absolutely irresistible army. You know, later on in Joshua, when they conquered Jericho, Jericho had maybe 1,000, top 1,500 inhabitants. If you have an army of 600,000 Israelite men coming against them, I mean, they would have capitulated hands down. And it would have taken them days to cross whatever water they were crossing here. There's no way 2 million people could have crossed over in just a night. So it's very, very unlikely there were actually 600,000 men, plus women and children leaving. So is the Bible wrong? Well, no. It's our linguistics that is a bit unreliable maybe. Because the possible solution to this conundrum is that the word elep, which is usually translated thousand, does also mean military division or unit, we could translate it as. And historically, such units may well have been much, much smaller. It could have been 10 people in a unit like that, before the word eventually came to mean 1,000. And I looked this up, and interestingly enough, our word 1,000, which we have is common to all the Germanic languages, also wasn't an exact number to begin with. If you go back far enough, it also just meant a big number. It didn't mean 10 times 100. That was only when they started translating the Latin and Greek words for 1,000. They used that word, and then of course it took on that meaning. So this Hebrew word probably didn't mean 1,000 when it was first written down. So this isn't a case of twisting the Bible to make it more believable and more palatable. Translation, as I pointed out last Sunday, can be very tricky. Words do change their meaning. So this explanation has been suggested by many sound evangelical scholars. It's not liberal theology. And I think it's quite important that if we want to take this seriously as actual history, it has to be logically and logistically possible. So it is actually more likely that there were about 20,000, 30,000 maybe, in somewhere in that region that left Egypt. And that is still a sizable group. It's still a noticeable loss of labour force. It would have impacted Egypt's economy. So it isn't surprising that it is still, well, seen as a bit of a problem, and Pharaoh changes his mind again, as we saw last week that he does fairly frequently. He hitches up his 600 elite chariots to pursue them, while God keeps guiding the people through this pillar towards the promised land. And, as we do know from Sunday school stories and elsewhere, they suddenly find themselves in trouble, caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. Literally, well, nearly. Pharaoh isn't quite the devil, and the sea probably wasn't quite as deep as we sometimes imagine, because again, we have a translation issue. Wherever this body of water was, it definitely wasn't what we today call the Red Sea, because there would have been quite out of course. God would have taken them, well, quite a long way around. I mean, I know Google Maps does that sometimes, but the Hebrew doesn't even mean the Red Sea. The Hebrew means a sea of reeds, and it's just a linguistic coincidence that red and reed are similar in English. In Swedish, for example, it would be completely different. The problem with this mistranslation is that we don't actually know where this body of water was that it crossed, but the whole area that they were traversing, that's a great word, between Egypt and Canaan, was marshy. There were reeds in many places, and there were quite a few different lakes. So there are several different suggestions as to which of these lakes, which may or may not exist anymore, because a lot of it now is a desert. Things changed a lot in 3,500 years. But it probably doesn't really matter which body of water it was they crossed, or whether it's still there or not. What does matter is what happened there, when they found themselves trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea, between Pharaoh and whatever body of water this was. And of course, the first thing that happens is that they grumble. Well, actually, the first thing that happens is that they cry out to God. And that, I hasten to say, is perfectly acceptable. They are scared, they are confused, they suddenly don't know what's going on, and their instinct is to cry out to God. That's great. If you have that instinct, please follow it. If you don't have it, maybe work on it. Our instinct should be to cry out to God when things don't seem to be going our way, or His way even. So that's perfectly acceptable. But then they go on to complain and grumble, which is less acceptable. Why did you take us here? We never wanted to leave Egypt in the first place, which is quite something. But that's exactly what they say. Didn't we say leave us alone? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Well, maybe that was true, but the thing is they weren't going to die in the desert. The problem is that they can't see God's solution here. They only see death. They're either going to die in this water, or they're going to be slaughtered by the Egyptian army. Which happens quite easily. They've forgotten maybe where they're heading. They don't trust that God can get them there, and the same thing happens to us. We don't see the end result of our faith. We don't always see where we're heading. We don't always remember where we're heading. We just see the sacrifices. We just see the troubles. And we find it quite hard, just like the Israelites, to believe in Romans 8:18. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. It isn't natural for us humans to believe that. We struggle. If we have sufferings, if we have to make sacrifices, that's all we see. So fear and doubt and the accompanying grumbling, it comes quite easily to all of us, doesn't it? I mean, more easy to some than others maybe, but we all find ourselves in that situation sometimes. We just look at the circumstances, we cannot work out what God is doing. We fear, we doubt, we probably grumble a bit to God as well. And that's where Moses' words comes in. Moses tells the Israelites, and because it was written down, he still tells us, if we find ourselves in a similar situation, don't be afraid, stand firm and calm down. Well, I know the Bible says be still, but it's the same thing. Don't be afraid, stand firm, calm down. God knows what we're facing. He knows what we're going through, but he also knows where we're heading. And he's the one with the power and strength to get us there. So we just have to learn to trust him, hold on to his promises, trust him to get us through. Stand firm in our faith. And as we know, it worked for the Israelites, because the second thing that happens is that God fights for them. He sends this strong wind, pushes the water aside, the dry land appears, and this is what we all sing together, isn't it? How did Moses cross the Red Sea? Well, except it wasn't just Moses, it was the whole people of Israel, and as I've just pointed out, it wasn't actually the Red Sea. But if you change it to the Reed Sea, it fits the tune. Did he fly? No. He just stretched his hand out. God did the rest. The Israelites do nothing except obey. And once it's possible, when the dry land has appeared, they cross through. And yet again, they're on the move in the middle of the night. And the pillar of fire goes before them to lead them on. And of course, when they move, and the barricade of cloud and fire between them and the Egyptians isn't there anymore, then the Egyptians charge ahead as well, because suddenly it's possible for them to move forward, following them out into the middle of the water. And it's a bit unclear exactly what happens. Again, the translation is difficult here, but it appears that the wheels get stuck in the mud, chariots start breaking, the axles break, horses panic, obviously, it's a bit of a strange situation. They're all thrown into confusion, and then the waters come surging back. And Israel is safe on the other side. And this completes the Exodus, which we started last week, because now the Israelites can proceed in peace to the promised land. Whereas Pharaoh in Egypt, they had to learn the hard way what it means when God fights for his people. He's lost his best charioteers, and he has to return to Egypt with his tail between his legs. And archaeology actually reveals quite a few consequences that all this had for Egypt. If we accept that the early dating with Amenhotep II being the pharaoh of the Exodus. Because Amenhotep II's mummy, as in his embalmed body, not his mother, is covered in small bumps, tubercles, boils, basically, as per the sixth plague. You can find this on Wikipedia, which doesn't tend to be sort of favourable to a Christian interpretation of the world. So this is secular archaeology telling us he's covered in bumps. They can't tell if it was a disease or if the embalmers made a mistake, but seeing as the embalmers were quite clever and skilled, it's much more likely this is actually the result of the sixth plague. We can also tell from archaeology that Amenhotep II was very active in building and warfare and all sorts of things at the beginning of his reign. And then suddenly, it just stops. No records of anything he did at the end of his life. And his life was unexpectedly short. He died young, in his 40s, which was young for a pharaoh. All of which suggests that he's had rather more stress and problems than your ordinary pharaoh. He was succeeded by Thutmose IV, who, as I pointed out last time, was not his firstborn son. And the records indicated there was some surprise as to the fact that he became pharaoh rather than the one who should have. And interestingly enough, during the reign of Amenhotep II and his successor, most of the monuments of Hatshepsut were destroyed and defaced. Remember Hatshepsut, Pharaoh's daughter? We can't know for sure why they destroyed all her monuments, but some people suggest maybe a revenge for having adopted Moses who caused all these problems. After him, we have Amenhotep III, who, interestingly enough, is known more as a pacifist than anything. He conducted just one war in his whole lifetime as a pharaoh, and that was to the south of Egypt, not to the north. Most of the pharaohs were very keen to wage war northwards into the Arabian Peninsula and Canaan and all that. Amenhotep III did nothing towards the north, maybe because that's where Israel is still circling around the wilderness under the leadership of Moses. And he also dedicated some 600 statues to the goddess of healing. Why did he suddenly find healing being so important? He was succeeded by Akhenaten, and he has a little observation that people aren't revering the old gods anymore. Well, you wonder why, when all the old gods have proved fairly unpowerful, as in powerless, against the God of Israel. His reaction to that was that he did away with all the gods and goddesses and made Egypt monotheistic. Where do you think he got that idea from, that there's only one God? Now, it didn't last. He picked the wrong god, because he picked the sun god, Aten, to be the one and only god of Egypt. But still, where did he get this idea of worshipping just one god? Because that would have been unknown until Moses came and said, oh, it's only this one God, and he's got all the power. And finally, in this little history lesson here, there's this whole bunch of letters written to Pharaoh Akhenaten by Canaanite rulers, so kings and mayors or local rulers in Canaan, asking for help because they are being overrun by a people group called the Habiru, who are conquering everything, taking over the country. Habiru sounds suspiciously similar to Hebrew, don't you think? So I think these letters sent by the Canaanite rulers to the Pharaoh of Egypt, who traditionally had sort of power in that part of the world, suggests that the Israelites did actually get there, and they were successful in conquering most of Canaan, just like the book of Joshua tells us. And it appears that Akhenaten didn't do anything, which also fits with the fact that he doesn't feature anywhere in the book of Joshua. Why am I telling you all of this? Well, partly because I like history. When I was young, I did think I might study archaeology before God sent me onto the theology route. But there is another reason. I think it's important to remember that these events aren't fairy tales. They're not just Sunday school stories intended to inspire us to believe. These things happen. They're written down because they happen. It's history. God operates in history with real people, real lives, and in this case, real deaths as well. And even though it sometimes gets a bit gruesome, it should be an encouragement for us, because we are also real people, I hope. You're not bots, are you? Artificially intelligent. We are real people in a real life situation, somewhere in time and space. And we need a God who is also active in real time and space. We don't need religious legends. We need a God who is active and alive and actually involved in what we're involved with. Although we might wish that some of these stories were just religious legends. I always feel queasy when you do these things. And when we did Exodus in our Bible study groups, these questions came up. Was this really necessary? Why do we have to have so many people dying? Well, that's one of these why questions that may not have a proper answer, but as an attempt at an answer at least. For one thing, it is a matter of divine judgment. This whole story of the Exodus started with the Egyptians drowning the Israelite baby boys. Now it ends, well, this part of the story ends with the Egyptians drowning, suffering the same fate. And as I've said many times, God has the divine prerogative of exercising judgment, and we'll come back to that as well. But it's also a matter of divine protection. God had to make sure that the Israelites were safe, that they could then camp out at Mount Sinai and receive the law and the covenant without worrying about Egypt suddenly turning around and coming around the corner and attacking them again. They had to be safe when God met with them on Sinai. So it's a matter of divine protection. And of course, it's a matter of divine sovereignty. Because God is here demonstrating yet again that ultimately no power in heaven or on earth will be able to stand against God and his rescue plan for humanity. Because, again, this is all still part of the plan of salvation, which started when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. God is bringing the people of Israel into the promised land, Canaan, a promised fertile land where they will be able to worship him, serve him freely, where he will dwell in their midst. That's what the tabernacle is all about. He will be their God, they will be his people, which is a promise that features in Exodus 6, when God speaks to Moses, and it keeps coming back through the Bible. And this promise, bringing the people into the promised land where they can worship him freely, is a foretaste and a foreshadowing of the ultimate promised land, the new heaven and the new earth, which will be even better than Canaan. Because not only will there be milk and honey and whatever else will be in the wedding feast of the Lamb, but there will be no sin, no sickness, no death. Humans will be living in full and free communion with God, not just through a tabernacle in a holy of holies where only the high priest would enter and the people had to worship from a distance. God will dwell in our midst. But in order for that to be possible, God has to make sure that nothing sinful, nothing evil, nothing impure can sneak into the new creation. So he has to exercise judgment on Satan and on those who don't want to submit to King Jesus. That's why there has to be final judgment. But like Pharaoh, Satan has already been decisively defeated by Jesus. Don't forget that. He may not acknowledge it yet, just like Pharaoh didn't accept that the Israelites had really gone, that he had actually lost them. He tried to get them back. The same way Satan keeps thrashing out against the church of Jesus, but the end is certain. Pharaoh was doomed to defeat, and so is Satan. He will be judged, he will be sentenced. But the good news, which is why this is all part of the plan of salvation, is that no human has to suffer that fate. God has provided a plan of rescue. Jesus himself took that punishment. Jesus took the judgment on himself. All you have to do is believe and accept. I said at the start that the Israelites weren't the ones who paid the price for their liberation. And the same is true with us. We have been set free from slavery to sin and death. But we didn't pay the price. Jesus paid the price. For our ultimate redemption, God himself took the suffering and death on himself. And that's how he defeated Satan. That's how he liberated us from our sinful nature. And he rose again, sent his Spirit, and he will lead us home. Jesus promised that he will be with us till the end. Jesus is with us, guiding us, supporting us, just like that pillar of cloud and fire that led the Israelites through the wilderness. Except it's even better because now we have the Holy Spirit dwelling in us, personally leading us, not just kind of a pillar at a distance. All we have to do is trust him and follow him. Believe that he knows what's going on, he knows what he's doing, whether or not we do, and he is able to get us safely home to the promised land. The Exodus, it was his dress rehearsal, if you like, and now he's leading his people home in an even greater exodus to an even better promised land. That is quite good news. Let's pray.